The hammering wind came first, not the flakes, not the frost, but that deep, gut-sick howl that told a man every mistake he'd ever made was about to come back for him. Danvers sat upright on his straw-padded bunk, every nerve yanked awake at once, eyes wide open in the pitch dark. The wind didn't sound right. It sounded heavier. It shook through the gaps in the chinked log walls, not as a whistle or whisper, but like something shoving hard against the very bones of the cabin, something not just cold, but full of teeth. Outside, in that December black Wyoming nothingness, the storm was coming sooner than anyone expected, and Danvers knew before the others did, because he slept closer to the ground. He always had, not from choice, but because that's where they told him to bunk, where the dirt was already warm from the rats, as Wills used to laugh. And it was also where Danvers had spent the last 4 weeks piling and shaping what they all mocked as his dirt stove. Said it wasn't a stove, said it was a pig nest, a mole bed, a mud coffin, but none of them had been sleeping down there when the ground started pushing back with heat. None of them had noticed the way frost stayed off the inside wall nearest Danvers's strange setup. None of them cared that he'd been gathering river rocks, hauling them up in a sack from the frozen creek bed by torchlight when everyone else slept, laying them just beneath the packed mud, surrounding a sunken vent chamber fed by a flue he dug inch by inch under the logs. They only noticed enough to laugh, but now Wills was coughing in his sleep, sharp, high in the chest, the kind of cough that didn't echo right. Danvers sat still, wrapped in his own thoughts. He counted 4 bodies snoring: Wills, the Hill brothers, and Ellery. That left him, and none of the others were awake yet. The wind kept on. He reached for the slab of burlap he used as a blanket and stood barefoot to test the floor. The wooden boards were cold enough to hurt, but just beside his bunk, where he'd layered the clay over packed earth, still warm, not hot, just enough to not kill you. It wasn't supposed to work. He wasn't even sure it would, not when he'd started carving out the trench beneath the sleeping platform, not when he'd threaded that old stovepipe elbow through the dirt wall and down into the cavity like a bent arm reaching to breathe. But something about it had taken. The first night he'd risked a small fire in the hollow chamber. It smoked so bad he nearly choked. But the second night, it drafted. The third, it stayed warm. Now it practically simmered through the nights, with only a few coals needed before bedding down. Nobody cared, of course. They'd written him off as half-cracked. Danvers and his mole hole, Wills said last week. Digging like some wild animal down there. Ain't no wonder the floor's starting to sag. The others laughed. He let them. Danvers moved across the cabin in the dark, careful not to wake the others. Outside, the wind screamed, but underneath it, he heard the real danger. A low moan, thick like a herd moving, snow coming fast, riding low, dragging whole sheets of sky down with it, the kind that buries whole cabins overnight. He'd seen one back in '78, and it took 3 weeks for them to dig out the bodies after. He pressed his hand against the log near the stove, frost already, inside the cabin, and still not a soul awake but him. He went to the firebox near the far wall, poked at the coals. Dead, nothing but ash and stone. Wills had let it die again, wouldn't wake up for his turn, wouldn't admit the chimney was a busted mess. Danvers shook his head, gathered a few sticks from the corner bin, but didn't bother trying to relight the box. It would never heat the place in time, not against what was coming. Instead, he went back to his bunk, knelt by the dirt, and opened the flue plate. A little smoke puffed up from the hidden chamber. Still heat. He fed a few coals in through the side port, added a piece of dry willow, then pulled the vent stone back in place. It would take an hour or more, but the heat would rise slow and steady under his bed, then crawl out through the trench vents, pushing warmth along the floor. It wouldn't save the others, not yet, but he had time. By morning the storm had arrived, full whiteout. The cabin was a box in a snow sea. The windows were bricked with ice. One of the Hill brothers, Caleb, tried to piss in the snow just outside and nearly lost a toe. When he came back in, half his boot crusted with blood and frost, he pointed at Danvers. "You got heat under that bunk of yours?" Danvers just looked up, didn't say much. The others started watching him after that, watching where he stepped, watching how the frost didn't seem to settle near his corner. Still didn't say anything, not yet. But that night, when the wind peeled against the roof and the chimney ice-cracked loud enough to sound like a rifle shot, Wills finally broke. "God damn it," he said through chattering teeth. "I ain't sleeping up here another night." He looked at Danvers' little corner, the packed dirt, the low clay wall, the hollow frame of the bunk built tight over the warm earth. "You got room down there, mole man?" Danvers didn't answer, just pulled his blanket tighter. By midnight, Ellery joined him. Then Caleb. Danvers didn't fight it, just shifted to make space, pointing out where the trench heat came in. "Don't sit over the vent. Let it flow." He said it quiet. They listened. The Hill boys were next. And still Wills held out. Pride, mostly. That was Wills's way. Didn't want to admit what he'd mocked had a use. But on the second night, when the firebox stone cracked clean through and the chimney spat a gout of smoke straight into the room. He came down too, silent, red-eyed, dragging his bedding like a beaten dog. They, all huddled in the dirt bunk, 5 grown men, curled around a warm cavity no bigger than a coffin trench, breathing together like it was a womb. And for once nobody said a word. That storm lasted 6 days. Not a break, not a pause. They dug out the door twice a day, just to keep it visible. Took turns knocking snow off the roof. But inside, they stayed alive, because of the heat that rose from Danvers' dirt stove. Wills tried to thank him once, cleared his throat, said something about good thinking after all. But Danvers didn't say anything back. He was thinking of the others, the cabins farther down the ridge, the ones without vents in the floor, without the crazy man who slept close to the ground. Because now, with nothing to prove and nothing to say, Danvers wasn't digging for warmth anymore. He was digging because he knew it wasn't over. The shovel moved slow now, not from lack of strength, but from what the cold did to joints. Like pouring molasses through a funnel and waiting for it to drip. Danvers had tied gunny sacks around his hands, then gloves over that, just to stop his fingers from locking mid-grip. The wind hadn't let up in 30 hours, and somewhere deep down, in his marrow, he felt it. The blizzard wasn't peaking. It was growing, crawling into its own monstrous shape. He was under the cabin now, not fully beneath it, not where the weight bore down, but in that low crawl space he'd widened when they first built the place, while the others hooted and drank, said he was sniffing mole holes again. They had called it a rat tunnel, a grave trench, a fool's waste of time. But now that space had become the difference between warmth and death. He had extended the heating trench by another 3 feet over the last day, angling it gently beneath the cabin's center, using packed clay and stone to wall it in, then sealing the new vent flue with a scavenged iron stovepipe lid he'd dug out of the snow near the old collapsed blacksmith's hut last fall. No one had cared when he hauled it up then. Trash, Wills had muttered, just more of Danvers' junk heap religion. Now it was gold. He heard a creak above, the thick groan of pine boards settling under shifting bodies. The men were awake, maybe arguing, maybe waiting to take turns at the hatch again. They called it the pit now, not his crazy dirt stove anymore, just the pit. Ellery had said it outright last night, shivering with one hand pressed to the trench vent. If that thing weren't here, we'd be chopping the walls to keep the fire going. Danvers hadn't replied. He was thinking of something else. When he emerged back into the cabin from the trapdoor he'd hidden beneath his cot, the air was stale with breath and sweat and the lingering ghost of burned wood. A thick crust of ice clung to the inside of the north wall. The only window had fogged into opacity days ago. Frost glittered across the nails in the ceiling beams like some madman had sewn diamonds into the roof. "Tell me that trench is still warm," Wills croaked, huddled in a blanket so threadbare it might have once been used to strain beans. He looked thinner, his cheeks sunken, his lips cracked. "It's warm," Danvers said simply, brushing snow from his shoulders. He didn't bother to explain how. Not anymore. They'd stopped asking questions. Somewhere around the second night of sleeping half buried in dirt that kept them alive, the laughter dried up, the mockery bled out. Now they watched him like children watch their father patch a leaking roof, not with admiration, but with terrified hope. "You sure it's safe?" Caleb asked suddenly from his place on the floor near the pit. Danvers turned. "What? I mean, what if the heat, cooks the ground too much, cracks the boards? You think it could catch?" Danvers just looked at him. Then, "You seen any fire jump upward?" Caleb didn't answer. The others didn't speak either. Danvers moved to his corner and sat again on the low bunk, the one he'd built tight to the earth, using no nails, only friction and weight. The top planks had warped from the heat. He could feel the faint vibration of warmth underneath. Not hot, never hot, but not dead either. Not like the firebox across the room. That was still clogged with ash and ice. Useless. That day passed slowly. They took turns sleeping. Talking was minimal. Food was worse. 2 tins of beans and 1 dry haunch of rabbit jerky they'd been saving. The storm hadn't let them hunt. Couldn't see 3 feet outside the door. No game. No tracks. Just wind that screamed so hard it sounded like voices sometimes. Like actual words caught in the gale. On the 4th night, things turned. It started with the roof. Danvers heard it. Not loud. Not sudden, just a faint shift, like a groan from something old and wounded. He stood instantly. The others didn't. He crossed to the far wall, pressed his hand against the beam. It was bowing. The snow load had become too much. He called out, "Get up!" Wills mumbled something. "I said get up, now!" The urgency in his voice cut through the exhaustion. They scrambled. Ellery nearly fell, trying to rise too fast. Danvers pointed up. "We're losing the roof." They didn't understand yet. Not fully, but they listened. All 5 men circled beneath the beam. Danvers pointed to the support post in the center of the room. "Help me brace it, now!" "We don't have a brace," said Micah Hill, wide-eyed. "We do. Danvers snapped. "The cot frames, the ones we ain't sleeping on. Rip the legs off. Cross-beam the post." They moved fast now. Cold makes men slow in the mind, but desperation wakes them. Within minutes, they'd yanked the sideboards off 2 bunks, hammered the timber into crude diagonal braces, and wedged them tight against the center post. It wasn't perfect, but it stopped the sag. For now, then came the crack. Outside, near the east wall, loud enough to rattle the bones. The snowdrift had collapsed half the woodpile. It was gone. Danvers didn't even curse. He just stared at the door, then back at the men. No more fire. They all looked at him, then at the dark box across the room, dead anyway. Then to the trench, the earth that still, impossibly, held warmth. "You think it'll hold?" Ellery whispered. Danvers didn't answer. That night the temperature dropped further. The wind stopped, not because the storm ended, but because it choked itself in snow. Silence like that only comes before something breaks, and by midnight Danvers knew the real danger had arrived. Suffocation. They hadn't dug the chimney out since the second day. The vents might be clogged. Carbon, oxygen loss. Men die like that, not screaming, but dreaming. 1 breath, 2, and they're gone. Danvers woke all of them. "We're digging out the chimney," he said. "In the dark? Better in the dark than never again." It took 2 hours. They opened the door by cutting it free from ice with a hatchet, crawling out one at a time like animals from a burrow. The snow was above the doorframe, a wall of it, pressed solid, heavy, tight. Danvers led, dug with his hands where the shovel bent, carved upward, sideways, guessed where the chimney rose, found it by feel, the edge of soot-slicked stone, the iron cap. Then he cleared the top, made a vent wide enough to fit both arms. He climbed back down into the cabin and looked at the others, who huddled near the trench. "It's clear," he said. "We'll breathe again." "You sure?" Wills asked. Danvers didn't say yes. He just sat down, rubbed his hands, and lit one of the last oil scraps. The flame flickered, steady. That night, nobody died. By morning, the roof creaked but held. The trench glowed faintly with warmth. The snow hadn't buried the flue again. They could breathe. They were alive. And still, nobody asked Danvers how he knew to build it, how he'd seen this coming, how he'd known to stay close to the ground, to draw heat from earth instead of sky, how he'd remembered stories from the war, from old mountain men near the Tetons, from a trapper with black fingers, and a shaking voice who once said, "Dig low, live long." Danvers had listened, and now, as the storm clawed and bit and howled without relent, they all slept near him, wrapped in burlap and hides, breathing slow, warm air rising from a trench they once mocked. And Danvers? He didn't sleep. He was thinking of the food, because the snow wasn't stopping, and warmth would mean nothing if they all starved inside a dirt-heated tomb. The next morning did not feel like morning. There was no light, only the faint suggestion of less darkness behind the iced-over window, a kind of stale grey that pressed against the cabin like wet wool. No birds, no wind, just that silence again, that thick, terrifying stillness that meant the storm had paused, not to retreat but to gather its breath for something worse. Danvers stood by the door with his coat on. The others were still bundled near the trench. The floorboards had grown brittle with frost. The planks curled and cracked under each step now. He wrapped a hand in cloth, gripped the iron latch and pulled. The door did not move. He leaned harder. Still no give. Snow had sealed it shut. He turned to the men and said nothing, just went to the stove and picked up the iron poker. Then he knelt by the dirt near the hidden trapdoor under his bunk and started clearing it. Ellery stirred first. "What are you doing?" Danvers didn't look up. "We're blocked in." The others rose slowly. Caleb rubbed frost from his eyebrows. "How bad?" "Too thick to push. I'm going under." Wills cursed under his breath. "You're serious? Through the tunnel? I built it wide enough for a man. Just need the vent side." "What if it collapsed?" Danvers gave him a hard stare. "Then I'll die warm." He didn't wait for permission. He pried up the hatch, slithered down into the trench, and vanished into the earth. The heat lingered in the walls of the tunnel. Not much, but enough to keep the clay from freezing. It was like crawling through the body of a sleeping animal. He inched forward until he reached the extension vent, the one he'd opened on the 4th night, just before the chimney scare. He'd only dug it 2 feet beyond the cabin, just enough for a second breath of air. Now, it was everything. Danvers started chipping. The packed snow outside had frozen into a wall. He punched at it with the poker, over and over. Then he used the back of his hand, knuckles raw. At last, it cracked, and the wind struck him like a thrown sheet of knives. He didn't try to climb out, not yet. He just reached an arm into the snowlight and pulled it back fast. He counted. 1, 2, 3, breathing steady. Good. The air was still thin, but not deadly. He squirmed back through the trench and climbed into the cabin. The men watched him, silent. "We've got air," he said. "That'll hold for now." Wills looked up from the dirt. "Now what?" Danvers didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the corner where their last food was kept, only there wasn't any. The tins were empty, the jerky, gone, and then the part none of them said, the rabbit bones had been boiled dry 2 days ago. The marrow scraped, there wasn't even lard left. He finally spoke. "We need to find more." Caleb gave a thin laugh. "You plan on finding elk under the snow?" "No," Danvers said, "but I know what's still out there." He left the words hanging. Micah's face twitched. "You mean the trap line?" Danvers nodded. "It's a mile out," Ellery said. "Downhill. You'll never get back up." "I won't have to," Danvers replied. "I'll use the runoff ridge near the pine." "Break. There's an old channel there. It should still be passable." Wills scoffed. "That channel's a death chute. One wrong step and you'll vanish under 6 feet of snow." Danvers turned to him. "Then you go." Nobody moved. He gathered what he could. A scrap of rawhide for his feet, 2 layers of cloth over his hands, the wool from under his bunk rolled around his chest, and one of the old iron cooking hooks lashed to a pole for balance. He pushed through the trench again, but this time when he cracked the vent open, he didn't stop. He used the hook to widen the hole, then pulled himself out. He emerged into a world buried in silence. The snow was piled past the cabin's roofline, trees bent like broken men, sky gone, just endless grey. He couldn't tell up from down at first, only that the air bit hard into his lungs, and the cold made everything inside him slow. Danvers turned south toward the pine break. The ridge was invisible, but he knew the count, 49 steps from the cabin wall to where the ground sloped and dropped. He started moving, careful not to break the crust too deep. He didn't walk, he slid, bent low, toes pointed, balance pole sweeping wide like a tightrope walker on a cliff. The world narrowed to one breath at a time. Half an hour passed, then a branch, a stump, a shape in the snow like a shadow. The trapline was near. He reached the first snare. Empty, second, empty, third, a twitch. He dropped fast, brushed snow aside. Rabbit, frozen, but fresh, still stiff, not yet bloated, caught clean by the leg. It hadn't struggled long. He took it, whispered a quiet thanks, and tucked it under his coat. Fourth snare, another twitch, 2 rabbits. Fifth, nothing. He turned to go, and nearly fell. The wind came back then, sudden, violent, shoving him forward. Danvers crawled for the pine break. The snow stung like hornets. He could feel the air growing thinner. He reached the channel, the old creek bed buried under snow, and let himself fall into it. The drop wasn't long, but the cold at the bottom was worse. A basin of ice, but the wind couldn't reach him here. He lay flat, caught his breath, and began the climb back. 1 foot, 1 breath, 1 movement at a time. He didn't know how long it took. Time was gone now. By the time he reached the trench vent again, his lips were cracked open and bleeding. 1 boot gone, toes numb. 1 rabbit crushed under his own body from the fall, but the other, still intact. He slid back into the cabin and dropped it on the floor. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Ellery whispered, "We eat tonight." They cooked it in the trench, cut the meat into strips and laid them on a flat rock over the side vent. It took hours, but the smell brought back something like life. Danvers didn't eat the first portion. He watched the others, their faces no longer full of mockery or laughter, only hunger, gratitude, and a silent kind of shame. Later that night, when the wind died again, Wills came to Danvers' bunk. He crouched low, voice ragged. "I said some things, back when we started, about your dirt stove, about you." Danvers didn't move. Wills went on. "I was wrong. We were all wrong." Danvers finally looked at him. "I didn't build it for pride." Wills nodded. "I know." There was silence. Then Danvers said, "You hear that?" Wills frowned. "What?" Danvers pointed to the roof. A new sound. Drip. Drip, drip, not from snowmelt, but from weakness. Water was seeping. That meant ice above had shifted, which meant weight had moved, which meant we need to brace the west beam, Danvers said suddenly. He stood fast now. The others sat up. "What is it?" Caleb asked. Danvers went to the wall, kicked away the frost, and slammed his fist into the logs. They gave. The entire back wall was bowing, not just sagging, cracking. The snow load wasn't even anymore. The slope behind the cabin must have collapsed under weight and shoved the drift against them. "We've got half an hour," Danvers said. "To do what?" "To dig a release trench." "A what?" "A chute," Danvers said. "From the back wall out and down, so the snow has somewhere to go when it gives. Otherwise it'll push straight through us." They stared at him like he was insane. Wills rose. "He's right. We do nothing. We die in here." Danvers nodded. "We start in the trench. We push under, slope it down. We work in shifts." They dug for 7 hours, through clay, snow, ice and rock. They used cooking pots, tin plates, bare hands. Danvers led every minute of it. When his arms went numb, he chewed leather just to stay awake. The wall held, and then it broke. A dull roar like thunder. Snow released. A wave of white crashed into the chute and roared down past the cabin's flank. But the wall stayed standing. The pressure released. The cabin shuddered but did not fall. They stood together, shaking, breath steaming. Danvers collapsed first, not from fear, but from relief. And still, the dirt stove burned, not with fire, but with something more human, something dug out of the ground when all else failed. Danvers woke to the sound of dripping again, but not from the roof this time. It was closer, slow, regular, drip, drip, the kind of sound that worms its way into a man's ear even in sleep. He opened his eyes, blinking against the haze of smoke and breath that had thickened in the cabin. For a few seconds, he thought maybe something was leaking from the trench vents, that one of the clay walls had cracked and water had found its way inside. Then he smelled it. Blood. He sat up fast, nearly knocking his head against the bunk slats above. Ellery was already crouched near the vent, his face pale and mouth drawn tight. "It's Wills," he said without looking up. His hand, Danvers was beside them in a moment. Wills was seated awkwardly against the wall, one hand wrapped in what looked like an old wool shirt, now soaked through with deep red. "What happened?" Wills shook his head, eyes glazed. "Went out the trench last night, just for air. Slipped, cut it on the iron plate. Didn't want to wake anyone." Danvers ripped the shirt away and hissed. The gash was wide, deep enough to show the bone of the thumb. Worse, it was already black at the edges. Not just blood loss, frostbite. "You've had this open since last night?" Danvers asked. Wills gave a weak nod. Didn't want to be a problem. Danvers said nothing. He turned to the others. "Boil snow, now. Get every clean cloth you've got." They scrambled. Micah fumbled the last scrap of rabbit hide, using it as a pad for the old tin pot they'd cooked with. The trench stone still had heat in it, barely enough to bring the snow melt to a simmer. Danvers washed the wound. Wills howled once, then clamped his jaw. The cabin felt silent as a tomb again. When he finished, Danvers wrapped the hand tight, using a strip of his own shirt. "You're not using that hand for anything now. You hear me?" Wills tried to nod. Didn't manage it, but they didn't have time to rest. The noise came back. Not a drip, not a groan, but a long, grinding scrape that came from the chimney. Danvers was on his feet again. "That's ice, moving." They all stared at the wall. Ellery whispered, "Is that bad?" Danvers turned slowly. "It's blocking the flue again." Nobody moved. Danvers sighed. "If the vent blocks, the heat backs up. Smoke builds. We all choke. But it's snowing again," Caleb muttered. "You go out? You'll freeze." Like Wills, Danvers looked toward the trapdoor under his bunk. He didn't argue. He just opened it. "I'm going." This time, Micah stopped him. "Let me come. You're beat to hell. You can't do this alone again." Danvers shook his head. "You'd slow me down. I ain't a child." "I didn't say you were." They stared at each other a long moment. Finally, Danvers relented. "All right, you crawl. I'll clear." They dropped into the trench, packed snow scraping their coats as they squeezed through. The walls radiated faint warmth still, just enough to keep their muscles moving. They reached the chimney vent and found it rimmed with ice, thick plates like glass crusted around the top. Danvers slammed it with the poker. The ice rang out like a bell. The second blow shattered it, but with it came a rush of smoke, thick, hot, choking. "Back!" Danvers yelled, coughing as the smoke barreled through the vent behind them, filling the trench. He shoved Micah back toward the cabin, crawling fast, dragging the younger man with one arm. The smoke swirled past them, into the crawl space, out the far end. It worked, barely. When they emerged back into the cabin, faces blackened and lungs heaving, Ellery had already flung open the front door hatch to vent the room. The air was bitter and cutting, but it saved them. Danvers sat on the floor and didn't speak for a long time. Micah sat beside him, his eyes wide. "I thought we were dead." "We will be," Danvers muttered, "if we don't stop letting this flue clog." "You want to dig it out again?" Danvers nodded slowly. "We dig the trench wider, expose the vent to more open air, pull the snow off the chimney from outside. I'll rig a cover, angled, not flat. Let it breathe, but not clog." The others were silent. He looked up at them. "You want to survive or not?" They began again. 3 more hours in the trench, Danvers working the iron poker until his palms split and bled. Micah hauling out snow with an old fur cap. Caleb packing down clay along the inner walls to keep them from caving. Ellery tending to Wills, who now drifted in and out of fever dreams. And still the dirt stove held. It hadn't failed, not once. Even with the trench dug wide, even with vents exposed to the brutal cold, the warmth persisted, like some quiet animal beneath them, breathing slow and patient. That night, Danvers slept near the vent, curled in the same position he had the first night he'd tested the system. He dreamt of nothing, because he was too far gone to dream. They woke to a sound none of them had expected to hear again, cracking ice. But this time, it was not beneath them or beside them. It was above. The roof sagged at the center beam, not from snow, but from melt. Danvers stood slowly, staring up. "It's warming," Micah nodded. "I felt it, barely, but it's there." They all climbed to their feet and listened. The logs creaked and flexed. The storm was ending. They didn't celebrate. Not yet. Danvers said, "Wait another day. It'll try once more." "What?" Ellery asked. "It always does. One last breath, one last shove." The others didn't argue. They spent the next hours strengthening the back wall, checking the brace timbers, and venting more of the trench. The food was gone again. No traps left, but no one complained. They could smell the change in the air now. Something lighter, less cruel. That night, Danvers sat alone by the flue and listened. And for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the wind died completely. No scream, no howl, only silence. He stepped outside before the sun rose. For the first time in days, not crawling, not fighting, but walking upright through the trench. The sky was open, clear, stars shining above like a map he hadn't seen in years. He stood there, barefoot in the snow, and let the cold wrap him for a minute. Then he smiled and turned back inside to tell the others. The blizzard was over, but the lesson had only just begun. The thaw came quiet, not like a river breaking or ice shattering from trees, just a shift, a softness in the snow's crust, a weight lifting from the sky. They didn't cheer, didn't rush to climb out or spread arms wide to the pale light. When you've spent weeks surviving in a box of cold silence, warmth doesn't feel like joy, it feels like suspicion. Danvers stepped out first. The trench tunnel had widened into something like a passageway now, the walls held in place with frost-hardened clay and crusted roots. He ducked through the chimney vent, pulled himself up the snow slope, and stood atop what used to be their roofline. Now it was a basin, sunken and buried, ringed with brittle pine and pale hills that stretched toward a horizon no one had seen in 12 days. The air was clear, still cold, but not cruel, not the kind that wanted to bury you. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the valley, the tree line, the distance toward the trail that led to the old mining road. The smoke trail was gone. The flags were gone. The cache was still somewhere beneath 8 feet of drift, but it wouldn't help them now. What mattered was that the sky had opened, the wind had shifted, and he could finally breathe without tasting snow. Behind him, Caleb and Micah climbed out next. Then Ellery. Will stayed inside, too weak now to move much, though his fever had broken and the wound on his hand, black at the fingers, no longer bled. Danvers led them to the ridge edge. He pointed to the southeast. "If we follow the slope down, stay out of the valley pocket, we can hit the creek before sundown." Ellery nodded slowly. "And from there?" "There's a supply station 5 miles further, if it hasn't been buried too." Caleb looked down at the snow. "That's a long way." Danvers turned to him. "It's easier than dying here." They returned to the cabin to gather what they could. Not much left. Some iron scraps, the last rabbit bone, a few strips of hide too stiff to chew, but good for binding. Danvers tore the canvas off the old cot frame, wrapped it around Wills's shoulders, and tied it with rope from the broken lantern. The trench stove still gave off warmth. After all that time, after the snow, the smoke, the freezing nights and near collapse, it had never gone out. Just a low, steady pulse of heat rising from the earth, from the stones he'd buried deep and the vent system he'd carved by hand. No one mocked it now. They wouldn't again. As they stood in the doorway one last time, Danvers crouched near the trench and placed a stone over the flue lid, not to seal it, just to mark it. "What are you doing?" Ellery asked. Danvers looked up. "Leaving it. For who?" He didn't answer, not right away. "For anyone desperate enough to need it." They moved slowly through the drifted woods. The snow came to their thighs at points, but the upper crust had hardened just enough to hold weight if stepped right. Danvers led them single file, cutting a switch from a dead pine to probe ahead with each step. He knew the ridgeline, knew where the gullies sank and the ice ponds lay hidden. The others trusted him now. They didn't question. Wills rode on a sled fashioned from Bunk, planks pulled by Caleb and Micah in shifts. The wind had died, but the sky stayed low, white, thick, like winter wasn't done speaking, only pausing to see if they'd learned anything. By dusk, they reached the creek bed. It was frozen solid, a glassy ribbon beneath the trees. They followed it south, hearts hammering with every step. When they reached the outpost station near sundown, no one spoke. It was still standing, a single log structure with a stone chimney and a drift-crusted roof. The door had been knocked in by snow, but inside was dry enough. A barrel of meal, salted pork in a sealed bin, clean water frozen in a keg, more than enough to keep them alive. Ellery laughed aloud, loud and ragged. Micah wept. Caleb dropped to his knees and kissed the stone floor. Danvers didn't smile. He sat in the corner, hands folded, staring out the window at the grey light that clung to the hills. He only spoke once the others had eaten. Once Wills had been laid beside the fire with warm cloths and broth in his mouth. It wasn't the dirt, Danvers said. The others turned. It wasn't the trench, or the vent, or the rocks. It wasn't any of that. Ellery frowned. What are you talking about? Danvers looked at them. It was listening. That's what saved us. He let the words hang. I heard the ground, heard what it needed, not what I wanted, not what they taught, not what the books say. I laid my head in the dirt and I listened, and the earth told me how not to die. The others were quiet. Then Micah said, well, thank God you did. But Danvers shook his head. God had nothing to do with it. Neither did luck. It was work. It was knowing that the only thing colder than winter is pride, and that if you wait for someone else to save you, you're already dead. Weeks passed. They recovered. Wills lost 2 fingers but kept his hand. The others returned to town, leaner, quieter. When asked what happened out there, they said very little. Just that a storm had come, that it had lasted too long, that not all cabins were built the same. Danvers returned to the woods that spring, not to rebuild, not to gather. He went to bury the trench. He sealed the flue, packed the vent with stone, covered the low crawl space with moss and soil, until it vanished into the landscape. Because it wasn't his anymore. It was a lesson. He never spoke of it again, but the others did, quietly in saloons and campfires. They told of the man with the dirt stove, the one they mocked, the one who dug into the ground when others built up toward the sky. They told of how heat rose from stone and clay, how smoke vented sideways, how men lived in a cabin that should have been their tomb, and how pride froze faster than bone when winter came. Years later, when another storm hit the pass, and a new group of trappers sought shelter along the ridge, they found nothing but snow. But one of them, a boy not yet 20, felt something under his feet. While digging a latrine, he brushed aside the snow, broke through packed soil, and uncovered a stone. Beneath it, clay, and beneath that, warmth. He dug and found a trench, and as the wind rose behind him, he crawled down into the earth and survived.